Hey, Stacey David here with the Tales of a Gearhead podcast. Now, what is this? Well, it's a podcast that covers everything automotive, everything mechanical, everything that's just cool about the automotive lifestyle. And since that's just about everything, you're going to love it. Let's get rolling. Okay, I've got a question for you out there. As you're listening to this podcast, is there a certain type of vehicle that just really intrigues you? For some people, it's motorcycles, the two-wheel motorcycle deal. For some, it's the trikes. For some, it's trucks, lowered trucks. Others, it's lifted 4x4s. For some people, it's everything. That's my problem. Think about that. Is there a particular thing or is a particular vehicle that just intrigues you or that you'd like to own? I tell you, one thing for me is tracked vehicles. Something on tracks is just intriguing to me. I don't know if it's because it's part tank or part, bulldozer or all of the above, but they're intriguing. And another thing that always is intriguing to gearheads is when you transcend what a vehicle is used for and make it to where it's usable in more than one area. For example, if you have a car and then you can make it float, or if you have a car and you can make it fly. I mean, think of all the James Bond movies and how cool those cars were that turned into submarines and stuff like that. I mean, Elon Musk was so enamored with that one that became a submarine in The Spy Who Loved Me. He actually bought that and is trying to turn that into a real operational car submarine thing. Of course, he's got the money to do it, so he'll probably pull it off. But anytime you can take a vehicle and create a multi-purpose vehicle that works, people are amazed by it. And I've got several of those things coming up on the show this season. But the reason that's so hard is generally when you do one thing, the other part suffers. So it's very hard to build an amphibious vehicle that's also still good on land. And probably the best people that have done that obviously have been some of the military things because they needed to. So they have landing craft that would come in off of the ships and stuff and then be able to crawl right up onto the beaches. They had vehicles that you could do that. They had ones, for the rice paddies and stuff of Vietnam. So we'll be going through some of the historical things of that. As you're thinking about it, what would be to you the ultimate vehicle? Would it be one that you could just drive and then it would fly? Or is it one that you could drive and then just go out into the water and float? Underwater? What would it be? Give that some thought. And then go out there and see if you can build it. Because you'd be surprised how many people have pulled these off. Some well, some others. I've got some that'll be coming up on the show that are examples of how well things were pulled off and not so well. I don't know if you remember the show I did years ago when I took that SureTrek vehicle. And it was basically like two fiberglass tubs, and each one had four wheels on it, and it was powered by a snowmobile engine. And then it pivoted in the center. Now, this was an amphibious vehicle that was also an all-terrain vehicle that also articulated. That's a lot of business going on there. And it didn't really do any of them very well. And they only made the thing 1 year because it was hard. It didn't steer well. There wasn't enough room. Anytime you have something moving in water that's just moved by the tires, that's the propulsion, that's not a really good propulsion system. You generally need some sort of prop or something. Now, it gets you by, and that's when you start getting into amphibious vehicles, there is a difference between an amphibian and a swimmer. A swimming vehicle is something that will float and will get you across still water. Kind of like these Argos, these 4 or 6 and 8-wheel drive Argo vehicles and stuff. That's what we call a swimmer. They'll float, you can get out there, but they'll just swim across the water. They're not a true amphibian. Generally, the way when people talk about an amphibious vehicle, it has a separate propulsion unit to move it in the water, not the tires or the tracks. That's a swimmer. So it's kind of a generic explanation, but that way if somebody tells you, hey, I have an amphibious vehicle, Well, immediately you should go, well, so it's got a separate propulsion system, like the ducks, the DUKs, the World War II vehicles. That was a truck, and then it also had a propeller underneath for moving it in the water. So they would actually move through the water like a boat and be more controllable, unlike some of the things like I've had on the show, like the Weasels and stuff like that just use tracks. They're basically a glorified cork in the water. They don't steer well. They don't control well, but they will get you across, a pond or that kind of thing. So keep that in mind when you're out shopping for a amphibious vehicle. Okay, this question comes from Mark, and Mark is working on a 70 CJ5 Jeep. Those are awesome, man. And he says, I need a tilt steering column for this thing. Yeah, you do. You can't hardly get into a CJ5 without a tilt column. And they didn't put them in until like the very last years of production. Now he says, I don't know what to put in this thing. What do I do? It's a 1970. Nobody has a direct replacement. What are my options? What do I need to modify? What do I need to do? Well, very, very common problem. Everybody that's driving an old CJ Jeep, whether it's a 5 or a 7, you need a tilt column in it. Now, the good news is they did do a tilt column in the CJ7s and stuff toward the end of the run. And I think some of the 5s did too. I just did this modification on a CJ5 on the show a couple years ago. Put a tilt column in it. Problem is, you're either going to have to find an original column out of a CJ7 or maybe a YJ and adapt it to work. It is not going to be a bolt-in deal at all. So you're going to have to cut, you're going to have to modify, you're going to have to make it fit. And the problem with using the old Jeep harnesses, they were known to break in the turn signal area. Some of the internals were just plastic, and so they're bad about breaking and hard to get parts for, and they're very hard to find because everybody wants them to put a tilt column in their Jeep. So I don't recommend even messing with that. Now, you can go to somebody like I Did It, and they do have a tilt column for the CJ7. And you could get one of those, and it's more of a street rod style deal, but it will fit a 7, and you could fit it into your Jeep. Now, there will be some cutting, there will be some fitting, there will be some stuff. That's what I did on that CJ5 that I did. And of course, my CJ5 was a 78, so a lot different dash configuration than yours. That's one way that you can go. However, the wiring, the plug-in and stuff is all going to be Jeep specific for those later years, which will not be compatible to yours. So what I would recommend is you go the street rod route. In other words, you're going to have to approach this just like you would do a tilt column into a street rod. And once again, I Did It's got all the stuff that you're going to need. They got great columns for this. But what this means is the first thing that you need to decide when you're looking at that is how you're going to connect the steering column to the steering box. And this is very important because a lot of those earlier vehicles, sometimes the steering box had the steering shaft and it's all one piece. So if you don't have a steering box that has just a connection like a rag link or a U-joint, then you're going to have to come up with that, which means you might have to change your steering box to something more modern. So you can see this can turn into a fairly good-sized project. If not, you will have to cut that shaft and then weld on the proper end with a proper weld, because welding a steering shaft, you need to know what you're doing because they're under a lot of pressure. You need to get a proper shaft for that. So what I would recommend is looking at that steering box, changing out the steering box to one that has a rag link or where you can put a U-joint on. Then once you've solved that problem, then you go to your column and you measure how long you want your column to be. And that is going from the steering wheel, where it comes out of the dash, so adjust it so it doesn't hit you in the chest, and then measure how far it will come through the firewall. Generally, I like something to come through the firewall 2 to 4 inches. And then, from where it comes through the firewall, that's where you'll use your steering shaft with the U-joints and connect down to the steering box. All this stuff is like on I Did It's website, all these things that you're going to need to connect it. Now, there is something else you need. You'll have to come up with how the column is going to be mounted in the dash. In other words, how low. So does it need a drop bracket, or do you utilize the existing brackets in the dash? You'll need to figure that out. And then you'll also need to figure out how it goes through the floor or the firewall. And once again, I Did It has several different versions on that would work with the column. So you're looking at all of those pieces. You're not only looking at the column, but you're looking at the column drop, you're looking at the floor mount, and you're looking at the steering shaft and the U-joints or rag link that will connect to the steering box. That's what you got to do, take into consideration to make it work. Now, the reason I suggest going this route is because if you try to find an old CJ7 column or whatever, you're going to go through these same issues trying to make it fit. Except you don't have the power of the aftermarket behind you. You're trying to deal with old, obsolete OEM parts, which means you got to either find them from a junkyard or from an auto parts store. And those guys aren't going to know what you're talking about at the auto parts store. You're going to be in there, and they're going to go, "What are you trying to do?" So all the homework is going to fall on you. So if you go the street rod route, the aftermarket, they've got all the parts that are compatible. And then when it comes time to plug in your wiring for your turn signals, it's going to have the right pigtail coming out. You can just wire right to that. You can put your wiring harness into it. Your turn signals work. Your flashers work. Your horn works. Yeah, that's what you want.
A successful automotive project takes planning and organization, but instead of using an old tablet or notebook, there's the Gears Deluxe Project Planning Book. This was designed to help you lay out a project, the parts, the tools, costs, and keep it organized with colored tabs, a pouch for receipts, and even a place to attach photos. If you decide to sell the vehicle, it serves as a complete history of what's been done. If you have a project or plan on starting one, the Gears Project Planning Book is the best way to lay it out and make it happen.
Okay, this question comes from Jim. Jim says, "Good afternoon." He said, "After years of searching, I found my dad's 64 GTO that he bought new." Wow. Man, what an awesome find, man. He says the car is all original with 80,000 original miles. Okay, well, that's really cool as well. And he says, "Now my question is, would it be okay to use synthetic blend oil in this car?" He said, "I was looking at using, a synthetic blend. This is Pentagrade." He said, "This is a good oil and has plenty of zinc, which is needed in these flat tappet engines." He says, "I only drive it during the summer months and was going to use 2050. Any thoughts on this?" First of all, congratulations on such an awesome car, man. Such great history. The fact that it has 80,000 miles and it's a 64, that's good and bad, especially when it comes to oil. Now, what you're looking at, this Pentagrade oil, this is a good oil. Using a synthetic blend is not a problem. Zinc is the key, as you know. For flat tappet engines, you need that extra zinc to lube those tappets and stuff to keep things from melting down. You've done your research on that. That's good. I only drive it in the summer months. That's not so good. You've heard the saying, it's better to drive something every once in a while than to let it sit for years and years and then have really low miles. And there is truth to that. I don't know if you guys saw the show we did last year where I pulled in that Jeepster, a 67 Jeepster that had 8,000 original miles on it. And I pulled the top end off of the engine, the intake. And the reason I did that was to change all the gaskets because they literally came out in pieces. And now the inside of the engine looked brand new. But what happens when these engines are not driven a lot, you subject the engine and the gaskets to a heat and cooling cycle that over time will really wear those gaskets out. Now, the way this works, when you get an engine hot and you drive it for a while, say for 30 minutes or an hour, and you get everything up to operating temperature and let it run, well, it keeps all those gaskets and everything nice and pliable. Then when you shut it down, it cools back down. And then when you fire it up again in a week or so, it just keeps everything nice and soft. And if you do that, it goes really well. Now, if you add in a lot of these hot and cold cycles, then add all the causticness of all of the things that are traveling through the engine and gases and oils and that kind of stuff, and then you let it sit for a long time, well, your gaskets start to get brittle and they start to crack. The rubber, around seals and stuff starts to get bad. And once they crack, you got a leak and they'll fall apart. So valve stem seals are notorious for just going to dust after a while. Rear main seals, valve cover gaskets, that's how come valve covers, they're always leaking. Intake gaskets, all of these kind of things. All easy things to fix. You don't have to pull the motor apart. Generally, head gaskets don't have a problem because they're under such pressure. But the rest of them are really subject to this. So the reason I say all that is that once you get a car out that's been sitting, even though this one, has 80,000 miles, this car sat a lot. So once you get it out and start driving it, don't be surprised if you start to have some oil consumption or maybe see some smoke here and there. And what's happening is you're starting to get some oil leakage through valve stem seals or intake gaskets. Those are the two main culprits. Those can all be fixed without taking the engine apart. Those can all be fixed, fairly simply, without rebuilding everything. Oil, using the proper oil, can help fix this. This is what you run into with a lot of synthetic oils. They're so slick that they will slip through these areas, cause these old crusty gaskets and stuff to crumble, and they can create an oil burner where you didn't have one before. And basically what had happened is all the old oil and sludge and stuff had kind of packed in there and kept it from leaking and kept it from burning oil. So that's one of the things with a synthetic blend that you might run into. If you're nervous about that, I would go to just a regular conventional oil with a lot of zinc in it and keep on that. I would not go to a full synthetic, but a semi-synthetic or a synthetic blend, you would probably be okay. But it's something I want to give you a little warning on. You could create an oil burner. Now, if you do, I can almost guarantee it's going to come through those valve stem seals and some of those other things. That's all easily replaceable from the top end. So it's not like you have to rebuild the engine to fix this. But you could run into the same problem. If this engine was beat and you have a lot of wear around the rings, that old sludge and that old oil stuff could be holding that in there and keeping you from burning oil through the rings. So keep that in mind. As far as your 2050, honestly, that's okay. I'd probably go a 2040. But with the engine you're doing, especially since it's got all the things I just talked about, 2050 might be safe, having that thicker oil in there if you're not driving it much. Either that, like I said, a 1040 or a 2050, either one of those would be fine. All right, this next question comes from Anthony. Anthony has a 63 Willys Wagon. Oh, that's such an awesome wagon. And he says, I want to do a full resto mod on it. And he said, I searched and I found your YouTube video of building the Wicked Willys. He said, I was wondering if there was any way I could get the build sheet or the parts list so I could do something similar to my Willys. Oh man, the Wicked Willys, I love that thing. The second I got rid of it, I regretted it. And actually, I've been looking for a Willys wagon ever since. Another one. And they're hard to find. So congratulations, 63, that's a good one. That's one of the later ones. We used to have that listed. I don't think it's on the website anymore, but I can kind of walk you through it a little bit. When I was putting that one together, I wanted to keep it, at that point, Dodge, owned Jeep and was involved with them. So I wanted to keep it Dodge. I wanted to use a Dodge engine, do something different. So I put a Magnum 360 in that thing, one of their crate engines. And that was awesome. And I followed that up with an NV 4500 5-speed. And then an Atlas II transfer case. So that was a nice setup. Then the axles, I believe I had Curry axles in that, a 44 in the front and a 9-inch in the rear. And I believe I was running 35s on that, which was a nice setup. It was probably required, it was about a 6-inch lift, I think, because I didn't cut the body or anything. Obviously, it would be easier to put a Chevrolet engine in your project if you don't care, they're cheaper, or a Ford. Ford and Chevy are always cheaper to get parts for in the aftermarket more options available. But the Dodge was cool. I would definitely suggest as you're approaching this, the first thing that you want to think about is what kind of axles that you're going to use. Now, because of the width of those Willys wagons, there's a lot out there that you can find, out of Wagoneers or things like that, where you can find used axles. There's even truck axles out of Dodges and stuff that are compatible. What you need to look at, though, is where your transfer case drop is. Generally, and I'm saying generally because there are exceptions to everything. And when I'm talking about transfer case drop, I'm talking about what side your transfer case drive shaft goes on the front, what side of the vehicle. For example, a lot of your Jeeps and GMs and Mopars, the drive shaft for the front axle goes down the passenger side. On some Fords, it comes down the driver's side. And then, of course, there's, exceptions out there. So what you don't want to do is find a transfer case that drops on the passenger side when you have an axle that has, a drop on the driver's side. So when you find that deal on those Super Duty axles, you better make sure the front axle has the right drop side or you can't use them. You'll end up either having getting a different transfer case or a different front axle. That's the biggest thing. Rear axles, not that big a deal. They're generally in the center or offset a little bit. And you can, take care of that with the drive shaft. You'll also want to decide if you're going to use a married transfer case or a divorced transfer case. Obviously, for those of you who don't know, the divorced transfer case is a transfer case that's mounted separately off the back of the engine and transmission. And the reason that's a military type setup. And the reason those are good is that you can drop any engine and transmission in, and then there's a little drive shaft that then connects to the transfer case. So the transfer case sits there by itself, separate. And then, of course, the married style, the transfer case bolts to the back of the transmission. Now, the reason this is an issue is obviously if you're bolting the transfer case to the back of the transmission, you need the right flange on the back of the transmission to bolt that transfer case on. These are different for Ford and Chevy and Dodge and Jeep and all that other stuff. So when you start hunting for parts, just make sure they're all compatible because it's real easy to get the wrong thing. You find a good deal. I bought a 205 transfer case, which is a great, super tough transfer case, and it was for a driver's side drop. So I still have it because I haven't used it on anything yet. Most of the ones that I've built have the drop for the front axle going down the passenger side. Good luck to you on that project, man. I'd love to see some pictures of that thing and how you're going to set it up. Like I said, I've always been a fan of those old Willys wagons, so can't wait to see it, Anthony. All right, that's our show for today, which means you need to get out there and start working on something. Spend some time turning wrenches. You might be surprised how much you like it. Also, make sure you check out our website, staceydavid.com, because we got all kinds of new products and some other great stuff that you're going to love. Also, make sure you check out our social media. That's Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, all at Official Stacey David. Our social media is where you're going to find all of the bonus content, the giveaways, the contests, the trivia. We even have extra viewer projects that focus on what you're working on. The new season of Gears will be on MAV TV, and YouTube will be the place that you can view all of your favorite Gears episodes, as well as the full project builds that follow the project from beginning to end. All right, that's all the announcements. We're all up to date. We'll see you next time.